told me he was stuck in traffic on the 405, but I was sitting in the parking lot of his office building watching his car. The one I had helped him pick out, the one with the dent on the rear bumper from the time he backed into a shopping cart, and swore it wasn't his fault, sitting perfectly still in space B14, exactly where it had been for the last 2 hours. I didn't call him out on it, I just said, "Okay, drive safe." And I sat there a little longer, watching that car, thinking about all the other times the story hadn't quite added up. That was a Tuesday in October. By the following spring, I had signed the divorce papers, refinanced the house into my name alone, and walked away with the portion of his 401k that my attorney told me I was legally entitled to, which turned out to be more than he expected and less than he deserved. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Sloane. I'm 31 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Los Angeles, which means I spend my days looking at numbers that don't add up and figuring out why. I am very good at my job. My ex-husband, knew what I did for a living. I used to think that would be enough of a deterrent. It wasn't. We met when I was 24, at a work happy hour. I almost didn't go to. He was charming in the way that some men are charming when they want something. Attentive, funny, full of this particular kind of focus that feels like being chosen. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged on a trip to Sedona. We got married at a vineyard in Santa Barbara in front of 83 people, most of whom I genuinely liked. We bought a house in Glendale. We got a dog, a golden retriever mix named Biscuit, who, for the record, stayed with me. The first 4 years were good, not perfect. No marriages, but good in the ways that matter. We argued about small things. Dishes. Whose turn it was to call the landlord before we owned the house. Whether to visit his parents for Thanksgiving or mine. Regular life friction, the kind that reminds you you're sharing space with another person. Then something shifted and I couldn't tell you exactly when. That's the thing nobody warns you about. It doesn't happen like a door slamming, it happens like a slow leak. By the time you notice the water on the floor, the damage has already been done. He started working later. I told myself it was the promotion. He'd moved into a regional director role, more responsibility, more travel. He started going to the gym in the evenings, which was new. His phone started going face down whenever he set it on the counter. I notice these things the way you notice a sound in your car that appears and disappears, aware of it, but not ready to commit to what it might mean. The traffic excuse was the first time I decided to actually look. I had driven to his office that evening to surprise him. I'd made a reservation at a restaurant we'd been meaning to try for months, the kind of Italian place where you need a reservation 6 weeks in advance, and I wanted to see the look on his face when I told him. I parked in the visitor lot across the street, texted him to say I was nearby and wanted to grab dinner, and watched the 3 dots appear and disappear for almost a minute before he replied. "Babe, I'm actually still stuck on the 405. Long day. Can we do something closer to home tonight?" His car was 12 feet from the entrance of his building. Hadn't moved. I sat there for a long time, not crying, not even angry yet, just very, very still, the way I get when I'm looking at a set of financials and I know something is wrong but I haven't found it yet. That particular stillness that comes before understanding. I drove home. I made eggs for dinner. I fed Biscuit and watched half of the show I don't remember, and went to bed before he got back, pretending to be asleep when I heard the door. I lay there in the dark and decided I was not going to confront him until I knew everything. Not a version of everything. Everything. I have a professional rule I've carried for years: never walk into a conversation with a hunch. Walk in with documentation. So I started documenting. The first thing I did was nothing dramatic. I simply began paying attention to our finances in a way I hadn't before. Not because I'd been careless, but because I trusted him to handle certain things, and I had let myself stay comfortable in that trust. We had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. We also each had individual accounts we'd kept from before the marriage, which had always seemed reasonable and healthy. What I found in the joint checking account when I actually looked at the transaction history with fresh eyes was a pattern of small withdrawals, nothing alarming on its own, $40 here, $60 there, cash withdrawals, which we almost never used. We were a tap-to-pay household. Over the previous 7 months, those small cash withdrawals totaled just under $4,000. I didn't say anything. I wrote it down. The second thing I found was a hotel charge from February. It was listed as a business expense. He had a company card that I had access to statements for, as we had set it up jointly when he started traveling more for work. The hotel was in Pasadena. His office was in Burbank. His conference that week had been in San Diego. I pulled up the conference itinerary I'd helped him print out back in February. San Diego Convention Center. The hotel charge was for a property 30 minutes from our house. I didn't say anything. I wrote it down. Over the next 6 weeks, I built what I can only describe as a very thorough, very organized, very devastating file. Dates, amounts, locations. A second hotel charge, this time under a different business category, client entertainment. The gym he joined that fall, which I'd assumed was a regular gym, turned out to have a location I'd never heard him mention, in Silver Lake, which is not on the way to his office or our house from any reasonable direction. I also started noticing the emotional data, if that makes sense. The way he laughed at his phone and tilted the screen. The way he was sometimes almost too attentive when he'd been distant all week. The overcorrection of someone managing guilt. The way he answered questions about his day with just enough detail to seem forthcoming without actually saying anything. I knew this man. I had lived inside his daily rhythms for 7 years, and I knew that the person who had been inhabiting his body for the past several months was performing a version of our marriage, not living it. I told one person, my best friend, she's been my closest friend since college, the kind of person who knows your full history and still shows up. And even with her, I kept most of the details to myself at first. I just told her I was concerned, that something felt off and that I was being careful. She asked me if I wanted her to come over. I told her not yet. I needed to stay in my head a little longer before I let anyone else into it. My attorney. I had found her through a colleague, a sharp woman who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for being methodical. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon from a parking garage so the call wouldn't show on her home Wi-Fi. I explained the situation. She asked good questions. She told me to keep documenting, to not move any money, to not tip him off, and to come see her in person when I was ready to talk about next steps. She also told me, clearly and firmly, not to confront him before we had our strategy in place. You confront him now, she said, and you lose the information advantage. He starts hiding things, he moves money, he gets his own attorney before you've had a chance to build yours. I heard her. I followed her advice. What broke open the control timeline was a Saturday in March. He told me he had a golf commitment, a work thing clients couldn't get out of it, he'd be back by 4. I had agreed to this. I had nodded and said to have fun and met none of it. After he left, I checked the location sharing app on our phones. We had set it up years ago, originally after a hiking trip where I'd worried about cell service. He had forgotten I was there. I had not. He drove north on the 2. He got off in La Cañada. He stopped moving at an address that was not a golf course. He sat at that address for 4 hours. I looked up the address. It was an apartment complex. I sat with that for a long time, longer than I expected, because even when you know, even when the file is sitting on your laptop and the evidence is stacked and your attorney has already confirmed that California is a no-fault state, but that financial misconduct absolutely matters during asset division. Even then, it is a different thing to see a dot on a map sitting still somewhere it shouldn't be. It's a different thing to watch the minutes count up. At 3047, he texted me, heading home, traffic's not bad, good day. I texted back a thumbs up. He walked in at 4:15 with a slight tan and no golf bag. He'd brought the clubs in his car when he left. I noticed they were gone from the garage, but he came in empty-handed. Said he'd left them in the car. Was cheerful. Asked about dinner. I made pasta. We ate at the kitchen table. Biscuit sat between us waiting for something to fall. I had a glass of wine and talked about nothing, and watched my husband of 6 years across the table and understood, with a clarity that felt almost administrative, that it was over. I met with my attorney the following week. I brought the file. She went through it with the kind of quiet focus I respect enormously. She identified the hotel charges as potential dissipation of marital assets. Under California law, money spent on an affair can sometimes be factored into property division, depending on how it's documented. The cash withdrawals were harder to prove directly, but they supported a larger pattern. She also helped me understand my retirement entitlements. We had been married long enough that I was entitled to a portion of his 401k through a QDRO, a qualified domestic relations order. He had contributed significantly more to his over the course of our marriage than I had to mine. My attorney advised me to make sure that was part of any settlement. We also talked about the house. We had purchased it together. I had contributed the down payment from money I'd saved before we married, which created a separate property argument. She told me we had a strong case for reimbursement of that amount off the top before the equity was split. I left her office and went to a coffee shop and sat for almost an hour. I didn't do anything. I just sat. I watched people walk past the window and tried to remember what it felt like to make plans with another person and mean them. Then I drove home and started thinking about what came next. I served him on a Tuesday. My attorney had arranged for a process server to handle it at his office, professionally, quietly, without drama. I had moved certain personal items and important documents to a secure location the weekend before. I had informed my bank of the pending proceedings. I had documented the contents of our home. He called me from the parking lot of his office building, 20 minutes after the papers were served. I could tell from his voice that he had stepped outside, that he was trying to be private and not succeeding, that the day had not gone the way he expected any day to go. "I can explain," he said. I had prepared for this moment for a long time. In my head, I had imagined all the versions of what I might say, the things I could ask, the parts of the past several months I could lay out for him, systematically the way I'd organize a report. Instead, I said, "You don't need to." Not because I wasn't angry. I was, but explaining was his need, not mine. I already knew what had happened. I had the documentation. I didn't need his version to feel certain about my own. He said my name. There was something in the way he said it, not quite desperation, but the early draft of it. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said. I thought about the hotel in Pasadena, the cash withdrawals adding up across 7 months, the Saturday with no golf bag and a thumbs-up text and pasta at the kitchen table. "I know," I said, and I meant it. People rarely mean for things to get as far as they get. That's not really the point, is it? The divorce took 8 months. There were tense conversations through attorneys and one very uncomfortable mediation session where we sat on opposite sides of a conference table and negotiated over the life we had built together. He pushed back on the retirement account. My attorney was prepared for that. He brought up that I had kept separate accounts throughout the marriage, a point that went nowhere legally. At one point, he said something about wanting to keep the house, and I watched his attorney's face, which was carefully neutral, and I thought, he doesn't know about the down payment argument. He found out shortly after. I kept the house. I was reimbursed the full amount of my down payment off the top of the equity. I received 34% of his 401k through the QDRO, which after 6 years of his contributions in a higher salary bracket was a number that surprised him considerably. The cash withdrawals and hotel charges were presented in the mediation as evidence of dissipation, and while they didn't result in a direct financial penalty, they changed the tone of the negotiation in ways that mattered. He got his car, his personal savings, some furniture we agreed he could take, and the information that his company's HR department had apparently received a quiet third-party notification about a potential conflict of interest involving a direct report. I did not send that notification. I want to be clear about that. I didn't need to. Someone else had apparently felt it was relevant. These things have a way of finding their own level. My best friend came over the night the papers were finalized. She brought wine and takeout from a Thai place we've been going to for 10 years. We sat on the couch with biscuit between us and ate pad CE, and didn't talk about him that much. We talked about a trip we'd been putting off. We talked about a show she'd been watching. We talked about the way the light in my living room had changed since I'd moved some furniture around and how it felt different now in a way that was actually better. At some point, she asked me how I was doing, not how I was coping or how I was holding up. Just, how are you doing? I thought about it for a second, genuinely thought about it. I'm okay, I said. I'm really actually okay. And I meant that too. There are things I still think about, not with grief exactly, but with the strange detached curiosity of someone reviewing a closed file. I think about the early years because they were real, even if what came later wasn't. I think about the version of my future I was building in my head. The kids we'd half discussed, the trip to Portugal we kept postponing, the kitchen renovation we had finally started budgeting for. I let myself think about those things sometimes, not to mourn them, but because pretending they didn't exist would feel dishonest. I also think about the Tuesday I drove to his parking lot and sat there watching his car and decided not to say anything yet. I think about the discipline that took. Because everything in me wanted to walk into that building and ask him to explain himself. I'm glad I didn't. Not because it wouldn't have felt good in the moment, but because I would have walked in with a hunch and walked out with a denial and nothing else. And I deserved more than that. I had earned more than that. People ask me, when I tell versions of this, which isn't often, whether I saw it coming. I say yes and no because that's the honest answer. I saw the data. I didn't want to read it. There's a version of me that kept her eyes half closed for longer than she should have, and I made a certain peace with her. She was trying to protect something she cared about. She just had to learn that protecting it wasn't the same as saving it. What I know now is this: the person who rebuilds after something like this isn't the same person who walked in. She's sharper in some ways and softer in others. She asks different questions. She has a better relationship with discomfort because she knows now that sitting with it long enough usually reveals something useful. I refinished the floors in the living room. I repainted the bedroom a color I'd always wanted, and he'd always thought was too dark. Biscuit has claimed the full width of the bed and shows no sign of surrendering any of it. I have a trip to Portugal booked for November with my best friend, and I genuinely cannot wait. I didn't need the ending I thought I needed. The one I got turned out to be better. I think about that parking lot more than I expected to. Not with anger anymore. More like the way you think about a moment that quietly changed the direction of everything. Not dramatic while it was happening. Just a woman sitting alone in a car, watching a dent on a rear bumper, deciding what kind of person she was going to be about this. I chose to be careful, and I think that choice was the whole thing. There's a version of this story where I walked into his building that night and demanded answers, where I let the hurt run ahead of the thinking. I've imagined that version. It feels satisfying for about 30 seconds, and then I see how it ends. Him denying, me with nothing documented, and all the leverage I didn't know I had yet, gone. The truth is that doing the right thing, the patient thing, the honest thing, it doesn't always feel righteous in the moment. Sometimes it just feels like eating eggs alone and pretending to be asleep when you hear the door. But it compounds. That's what I've come to believe. Every choice to act with integrity, to not tip him off, to not drain the joint account out of spite, to let the legal process work the way it was designed to work. Each of those choices built something. Not just a better settlement, something in me. A kind of steadiness I don't think I had before. I used to think being smart meant seeing things quickly. Now I think it means being willing to sit with what you see long enough to understand it fully. There were weeks where I had enough information to blow the whole thing open, and I held it. I kept working, I kept looking. And what I found in that extra time, the hotel charge in Pasadena, the pattern in the withdrawals, the location data on a Saturday afternoon, that information changed not just what I received at the end, but the entire shape of how I walked out. That's the thing nobody tells you about going through something like this. The outcome matters, but the way you carry yourself through it matters more. Because you have to live with that version of yourself long after the papers are signed and the furniture is gone and the dog has claimed his side of the bed. My ex-husband made his choices. I'm genuinely not interested in cataloging what those cost him. What I know is that people who treat others as something to be managed rather than someone to be honest with, eventually the accounting comes due. Not as punishment from some outside force, just as the natural result of the kind of life you build when you operate that way. Things fall apart. Trust, once spent, doesn't come back. The story catches up. And I made my choices. I stayed methodical when I wanted to be reactive. I stayed honest when it would have been easier to be vindictive. I got back up, slowly, deliberately, and I rebuilt the space around me into something that actually fit who I was becoming. The floors are refinished. The bedroom is the color I always wanted. There's a trip to Portugal booked for November. I didn't need the ending I thought I needed. The one I got is better.